Good morning, Morai Rabotai, Bruchim Abayim, to another edition of our Parashat Shiur, the Perush of Zera Shimshon from Av Shimshon Chaim Nachmani, Ben Rahman Michael, one of the Gedolei Italia, as we mention always. He was a Ben Dor of Or HaChaim HaKadosh, and he writes in the preface to his Sefer that he promises to advocate on behalf of those who spend time learning his chidushim. Again, this was his way of adopting spiritual children, since he did not end up with any children. His only child passed away, unfortunately, Rahman Litzlan. And it should be a zchut for his neshama, of course, and for all those who are awaiting Zera Shel Kayama and Shiduchim, so the specific areas that he mentions. And this should be also for the zchut of those who work hard to make this weekly shiur possible, especially the Rosh Gadolian family, the Balanes and Terani families. Bezat Hashem should be a zchut for them. Amen. So we're going to study together Ma'amar Tet, the 9th essay that he writes on Parashat Shemot. And that's about the encounter that Moshe Rabbeinu has with Hashem, the first encounter that he has by the burning bush, the Seneh. According to the Ramban, already that was the level of Panim el Panim, even though that this is before Matan Torah, this was already the highest level of Nevuah that's designed only for Moshe Rabbeinu, like the Gaon writes in the beginning of Sefer Yeshayahu, Aspaklaria ha-me'ira shebe-me'ira, a direct connection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Moshe Rabbeinu, which really did not ever happen with any of the other Nevi'im, aside from the Jews by Har Sinai, which is again the same place over here with the Seneh, that all of them got Aspaklaria ha-me'ira shebe-me'ira. They experienced the level of Panim el Panim with the two first of the 10 commandments of Anochi Hashem Elokecha v'lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. But nevertheless, let's study a little bit of the questions that he has on a Midrash, on Yalkut, that he brings a very strange comment of the Midrash there in Remez Kuf Samechtet. Ve'hineh haseneh bo'er ba'esh. The Pasuk says Moshe Rabbeinu was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, and he notices that there is a bush tree that is on fire, flames going up from this bush, and yet the bush is completely intact. You don't see any burnt branches, you don't see any broken branches, especially when you have a thorn bush. It's very thin. You have 5 minutes and already the outer things completely burn in. It's very noticeable when you have the entire bush intact and yet you have flames going up, like everything is literally on fire. And this is what he saw. Very strange. The Midrash, by the way, says that this was going on for weeks. Nobody paid attention. Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that paid attention. That by itself is a whole shiur of not taking things for granted. And the Midrash says in Bereshit Rabbah, in Shemot Rabbah rather, says, Sarta lirot. Hashem says, oh, you cared? Chayech, I swear that you're going to be shepherding my flock instead of your father-in-law's flock, which is a tremendous thing. And according to Machloket Rabbi Yochanan Shtakish there, if he turned away, or step 3 steps, even doing something small, when you care, it matters a lot. But that's not what he wants to say. There's a lot of exciting things to say about this Midrash, but the Midrash in Yalkut says that this was in the zchut of Yosef HaTzadik, which seems, on face value, seems like to have zero to do with each other. We're done with Yosef in Parashat Vayechi, finished. Like in Shemot, there's no mention of Yosef really. He doesn't do anything necessarily, and yet the Midrash says, and I read, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yidei sin'ah shesan'u echav leYosef, because of the hatred that the brothers of Yosef hated him. Yardu leMitzrayim, they went down to Egypt. The Galut started because of that. Ubizchuto, and because of him, bishvilo ani nigle baseneh ve'egal otam. Because of him, Yosef, I am appearing in a thorn bush, and I will redeem them. And then he brings the pasuk from Tehillim in Perek Ayin Zayin. Ga'alta bizroa amecha. David HaMelech says, Hashem, you saved your nation with outstretched arm. Bnei Yaakov veYosef Sela. The sons of Yaakov and Yosef forever. So, Bnei Yaakov, I understand. We're Bnei Yisrael. But Bnei Yosef, it's clearly saying that Ga'alta bizroa amecha. The fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved Am Yisrael was because of Yosef. So says the Zera Shimshon, V'hu tamua. He's going to ask multiple questions, like his derech is always to do so. He says, first of all, Ma inyan ze lazeh? What's the kesher? Ma kesher? What's the connection between Yosef and the burning bush, sinah of the brothers, and coming down to Mitzrayim and going out? Because Ve'od. And secondly, what's the pasuk of Tehillim doing with over here? Yosef. The pasuk says, let's read it again. Galta bizra amecha, bene, help me out, Yaakov veYosef Sela. It says Yaakov and Yosef. So how can he say that the Geulah was in the zchut of Yosef, where the pasuk says Yaakov veYosef? Really was Yaakov first, if anything. It wasn't just the merit of Yosef, it was the merit at the most, it was the merit of Yaakov firstly, and then Yosef. So how does that match the midrash that says, I am going to save them in the zchut of Yosef? And thirdly, what does the burning bush has got to do with anything? What does that have to do with the sinah of the brothers? It's a burning bush. Now, the analogy, the imagery of the burning bush is a beautiful, beautiful imagery. Like, the pasuk says in Tehillim, Tzadi Aleph, Imo Anochi Batzara, right? We say this in our daily tefillot. And that's what's brought. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to show Moshe Rabbeinu, the first imagery is, you think I've just left them to burn? I am there. The Shekhinah is in a burning bush. That I am suffering with them. Like the Gemara says, when a Jew, one Jew, is in suffering, Hashem says, Kalani miroshi, Kalani mizroa. Says, my kaviyachol, if you would want to mention an imagery that the Gemara does, says, my head is aching, my head is heavy on me, my arms are heavy. It's like a sick person. Hashem says, it's paining me. I'm aching for this one Jew that is in pain. One Jew. Imagine the community. So that's why, hence the beautiful imagery. That's, by the way, a fulfillment of the pasuk that last week's Parashat, Hashem tells Yaakov, and he stops on the way to Mitzrayim and says, don't worry, I'm going down with you to Mitzrayim, and I will bring you back up. I'm going to be there with you in the Galut, right? That's why the Zohar HaKadosh, in parts that we read, the Sfaradim in Patach Eliyahu is part of Zohar HaKadosh, and it says, Heshchinta begaluta. It says, you think from the day that I destroyed my Bet HaMikdash, I went up there and I'm doing well? No. Shiroshinim da tal. Tal is only ot yud, ot he, ve'ot vav. But Heshchinta begaluta. Part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shekhinah, so to speak, is with us in Galut. It never has a completion, right? En Hashem shalem, en Akiseh shalem. So that's beautiful imagery that exists even without his questions. But now, Rabbi Shimshon Nachmani says a magnificent insight. V'yesh lomar. The kavanat midrashi letaretz lama davka nigla HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe b'Sinai. Midrash is pointing out why in a burning bush? Why in a thorn bush? Thorn bush? Maybe an imagery of Bet HaMikdash, a future Mikdash. Maybe the imagery of Akedat Yitzchak, because this is on Har Sinai, right? It says, says, I am giving you a sign that that in 50 Tavdu Nun, right? Tavdu, in 50 days, you're going to be back here. 50 days after you come out of Mitzrayim, you're going to be accepting the Torah on this mountain. So this was on Har Sinai, right? And the imagery of having a burning bush instead of all the other images that you could have had, is the point of the Midrash. Umitchila metaretz, and the Midrash answers, shehaseneh hu lashon sin'ah, that seneh, samech and sin are interchangeable, the most interchangeable of everything. There are others as well, but this is the most. You find this many, many times. For instance, the pasuk says always when referring to earthenware, right? Klicheres in Chumash is written with the sin. In Gemara and Mishnah, it's always with the samech, because in samech and sin are interchangeable. So Sinai is coming from the lashon of sin'ah, of hatred. This actually is the analogy of this is brought in Midrashim, that you could lose count of how many they are, but it's really in the Gemara Shabbat Daf Peitet Amud Bet as well. Gemara says called Harachorev, Har Sinai. It's called also She'adam Mimenu Churban Leolam. That came from Har Sinai, came Churban, came destruction, came Sin'ah. Right? The Drashot Haran, the Ran in his Drashot explains that Yarda Sin'ah Leolam. This is just in parentheses. It's a good thing for the Jews, not a bad thing. The fact that we all say, anti-Semitism, and this is it's not always a bad thing. The Ran writes in his Drashot, that was one of the greatest names in the list of the Rishonim, says, when they hate you, don't marry them. When they hate you, you don't eat their food. When they hate you, you'll explore your Judaism more. Right? When you see that you're not accepted, then you won't have 30 plus million assimilated Jews in the 75 years in the United States that we've had based on Pew Research, right? You'll do much better as a nation, even though that's uncomfortable, but sometimes uncomfortable is good, right? At least when things are not perfect, when things are broken already, you're in Galut, and that's how it is. But he says, Keshem shkalut Mitzrayim ba ba'avon mechilat Yosef. We know that the entire Galut started because the brothers couldn't take Yosef. They hated him. ויוסיפו עוד שנאו אותו. על חלומותיו ועל דבריו. המלוך תמלוך עלינו, אם משול תמשול בנו. They hated him. They hated Yosef, and because of that, we had the Galut. And they caused pain. 22 years of pain for their father. 22, we spoke about the Kibbutz Abayim on Friday night. How it creates a reality in the world, right? I spoke about the story, the magnificent story of Rabinovich Shlita. But they caused pain. And now he brings from the Megalei Amukot. Megalei Amukot was a tremendous, tremendous person. Mekubala Eloki. He was Baal Ruach HaKodesh. He was Zocheh LeGilui Eliyahu. Tremendous person, 400 plus years ago. Rab Natan Nata Shapira. Tremendous, tremendous effort. He brings from Megalei Amukot in Parashat Beshalach. This is a little bit later on. He says, "Lefi shvatim garmu la'aviem leit'abel 22 shanim." Because the Shvatim caused pain for their father 22 years. Now, even though, and this is mind-boggling, even though that Yaakov deserved it, because he also separated himself from his parents 22 years. So his son was separate from him 22 years. Everything is interconnected. Is a magnificent system of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, beyond thought. But Lema said, even though the Jews had to go to Galut, but Mitzrayim got punished because they chose to be the ones. Here HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have done Yosef in any way possible, but they chose to be the one. They pained their father, says the Megalei Amukot. For every one of the Shvatim, it was 22 years of Galut. Right? Times 10, because Yosef and Binyamin, of course, were not part of it. That's 220 years of Galut that was Nigzar and the Jews to go there. Now this, he brings it really, the Zera Shimshon does not bring the actual language of the, if you take a look inside the Megalei Amukot, he brings it from Zohar. The Zohar HaKadosh says this in Parashat Beshalach over there, and he says that the pasuk in Shir Hashirim, that says Kol Dodi Dofek, right, which is the analogy of Geula. Kol dodi dofek means my beloved one is knocking. Pitchili, achoti rayati, yonati tamati, sheroshi nimlatal. That same thing that Zohar picks up on nimlatal, that the hair of the Shekhinah is in Galut. That is talking about when Hashem finally knocks on the door and says, okay, time came for Geula. And says the Zohar HaKadosh, Kol dodi dofek gimatria resh chaf. It's a gimatria of 220. So what happened with the 10 years that was less? Because we know, Redu Shama, Yaakov Avinu says to the Shvatim, go down to Mitzrayim, Redu is Gimatria 210. They stayed in Mitzrayim 210 years, not 220. So says the Megillah Mamukot, because each one of them died in Galut instead of dying in Eretz Yisrael, and their atzamot had to be moved around and so on and so forth. That was like a kapara. It's not clear exactly how he learns it. So this is my inside input. So it's a kapara for 1 year. So each one of them, 22 minus 1. So it ends up being 210 years of galut, niglab, and therefore, says the Zera Shimshon, mishum hachi niglab haseneh lirmos shtama galut haya bishvil hasinah. That's why it was in Seneh, because Seneh, again, if you write it with the sin interchangeably, it shows a language of sin'ah, that this whole thing started because of the sin'ah of the brothers towards Yosef. So it's like a multi-layer. Har Sinai, the same place that they accepted the Torah later on, a year plus from this event, also became Har Sinai, a place of sin'ah for the Jews, but here started from sin'ah, really, of the brothers. You see how far-reaching a sin'ah, a feeling, could be. And says, Zera Shimshon, lirmos shetam hagalut hay b'shvil hasin'ah, ve'ata shenishlemuu redu shana ra'uim leigael. So he's telling him, now it's finished. He's telling Moshe, he says, now the 210 years, they finished their amount of years. Now I'm going to redeem them. Hence, I'm appearing to you to go and do this, right? By the way, of course, part of the imagery of the Seneh is, even though that is on fire, even though that you could bother the Jews, you could enslave them, you could exile them, you could kill some of them, but you could never finish them. You can never finish them. We could go through difficulty, we could come out stronger, right? It never is consumed with the fire. Could be on fire, but it's not, could go through difficulty, but it's not consumed with it. But nevertheless, that's the first piece that it says. Now, here, you have to notice something, which is really the hemshech of the Yalkut that he brings, is mashma. It sounds like there is another reason for the galut, not just because of this sin'ah of the brothers, but the midrash is mashma. And by the way, the Ramban writes in the beginning of Parashat Vayechi, the first piece is, I think it's Perek Mem Zayin Pasuk Chavchet, the first pasuk of Parashat Vayechi. Ramban writes that this whole thing of Yaakov going down to Mitzrayim and coming, it's the exact DNA of our final galut that we're going to have under Edom, under Esav. Ramban clearly writes and shows it in the Psukim, is magnificent. And the Gemara says, by the way, the Gemara says in Masechet Yuma, Daftet, Yerushalmi in Yuma as well, Daf Hey, depending on what thing you have, that the second Beit HaMikdash, which is the final galut of Edom now, was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. So this really, with the Ramban projecting this, taking it out of just Yaakov and Mitzrayim and putting it on a projector for the history of Am Yisrael being especially our galut, the final galut in the Western culture of Edom, really this becomes that much more tangible, that this whole thing was because of Sinat. The Gemara says that also was because of sin, because they are mirror image of one another. And says the Midrash now, Aval ze kashe the dilma galutu mitam acher. Maybe the galut is for a different reason. The katav halev Aryeh. He brings from Lev Aryeh in the beginning of Parashat Shemot. He's also quoting a Gali Razia. excuse me, שבשביל שהביא יעקב אבינו לשום תרגום בתורה, it's a whole different reason. That because Yaakov, it was a chet of Yaakov Avinu, that he introduced a foreign culture in the Torah. Now, if you really pay attention, there is one word in the Torah that's Aramaic. It's not Lashon HaKodesh. And that's in the conversation that Yaakov has with Lavan. Really, Yaakov Avinu initiated this, right? That they should make this whole pile of avanim, right? Gal Ed, he called it. And Lavan put his poison inside the Torah, his culture. See, every time that every Jew would bring his thing of Masrot, Vidui Maaser, you say Arami Oved Avi Vayered Nisra. We say in Haggadah Shel Pesach every year, even now, even after Churban. It's the only thing that's said even after Churban every year. But when you had the Beit HaMikdash, you bring your Maaser, you say Arami Oved Avi Vayered Nisraima. Why do we have to talk about Lavan? Lavan is gone. No. Lavan's influence of, Habanim Banai, Habanot Banotai, everything, V'kol asher ata ro'eh lihu, everything is mine. His mindset, and we say he wanted to uproot everything. How? When you say it's mine, it's mindset. When I could change your mindset, your culture, your language, your name, that instead of Reuben, you're now whatever, Robert, or whatnot, I destroyed you. It's just a matter of time. And that he puts in the Chumash when Yaakov calls it Gal Ed, that this Gal of Avanim, this pile, should be an Ed, a testimony. Lavan says, no, we're not going to call it Hebrew. We're going to go Aramaic over here, my language. He called it Yegar Sahaduta. It's mentioned in the Chumash, the only two words that are Aramaic. And says, the Midrash, that this was a chet of Yaakov Avinu that introduced Goyish culture, so to speak, into our Torah. Yaakov garam ze. He was the cause. Yaakov was the cause of this. Sha'amar le'echav liktu avanim ve'yikru avanim ve'asu gal bishvil ze ba'u Yisrael begalut Mitzrayim. When you introduce something of Goyim, you bring the Goyim into your life, you're impacted by them, you're impressed by them, they will gain shlita over you. Now, if this sounds strange to you, let me give you, I could bring you so many sources for this, but that will boggle your mind. But this is consistently and all over the place. For instance, the Gemara that we just learned together a bunch of months ago, in Daf Tet Zayin Amud Bet, going on Yud Zayin, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, it says, Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus, Tana Eloki was nitpas leminut, which means they suspected that he was a min, and he had to say Ne'eman Harai Hatayan. He had to say a double-edged language that sounded to any onlooker that he said, yeah, I believe to minut, I believe to. And he himself, and that's how he was standing in the building that they would drop him dead from up there and kill him right away if he would not win the case. And he won it. But in order to win it, he had to say something very questionable. The Rambam uses this in Yigeret HaShemot, beyond the scope of this talk, way beyond. But afterwards, Rabbi Eliezer was killing himself. He was so upset. Why did this happen to me? Imagine a person that's learning and teaching Torah the whole time. This should happen to him? And Rabbi Akiva, he saved the day with his genius, like always he would do. Says Rabbi, maybe you benefited from minut. You enjoyed minut once in your life, and that's why the minut took a hold of you. And he says, yes, I remember there was this guy, Yaakov Ish Kfar Sechania, that he said something so smart, a pshat in the pasuk, and I had such gishmak from it. And Gemara says that was the reason. Why? Because if you enjoy, if you give a foothold in a culture that is against the Torah, that culture will take hold of you. And that's exactly what it's saying. Yaakov Avinu introduced this to the. We went to Galut because of it. Now listen to what he does with it, which is the last few minutes that we have. I want to just go get through this. So it says, that's why we say, Arami Oved Avi Vayered Mitzrayma. You hear this? Because of Lavan Arami Oved Avi, Vayer Nisraim, Yaakov had to go to Mitzrayim because of the introduction that he gave, the foothold that he gave to Lavan Arami, and that's why it says Anus al pi dibur, right? Anus al pi dibur means we were ne'enas, we're forced to go down because of the dibur, because of that speech that he had, Yegar Sahaduta, the introduction of a culture that's against Torah. Now, then he goes into Kabbalistic thing. He says Lashon Targum, Lashon Arami is really miyuchad for chitzonim. That's why the Gemara in Sotah Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph says that the Malachim don't reckon with Lashon Arami. They don't reckon because the Lashon of chitzonim, right? So he goes in explaining that, and now we have to explain what's the seneh over here, right? According to this understanding of the Midrash, now what's the burning bush? Says the Zera Shimshon. Mishum hachi siyem midrash ubishvilo ani nigla besene. That because of Yosef, I am appearing in Seneh, because Yosef was metaken. Yosef fixed this avon of Yaakov. How so? Shelo shinu et leshonam, et shemam, et leshonam, et malbusham. All of it started from Yosef. Yosef made a precedent that he would look Jewish. He would speak Lashon HaKodesh. Even though that the Midrash says, Yalkut says in Parashat Vayigash, that the Malach, before the night of Rosh Hashanah, before he stands in front of Paro, he came and taught him 70 languages. Only to Paro he would speak. Otherwise, he would speak Lashon HaKodesh. Even to other people, he would speak Lashon HaKodesh. He's so proud, right? That's why when Eshet Potifera wants to slander him, he says, Re'u hevi lanu ish ivri. When the Egyptian, that's what it was. He was a ish ivri. V'sham itanu, the Sarah Mashkim is talking to Paro. Sham itanu nar ivri. His identification of how he looked and his name. He was named by Yosef. He could have changed his name to a nice Egyptian modern name. Here, Yosef. Even after Paro changed his name to Sofnat Panech, it's Yosef. He's asking, what's your name? It's Yosef. Right? Tremendous. He was proud of, and we spoke about this 2 weeks ago, 2 shiurs ago, that he was the fire of Yaakov. Right? And maybe, perhaps, the analogy of fire, a flame, because it says, V'haya bet Yaakov le'esh, bet Yosef le'lehava, ubet Esav lekash. I'm putting my own 2 cents over here, and that would explain the pasuk in Tehillim that we brought in Ein Zayin, that he's saying that's why it says Bnei Yaakov veYosef Selah, because Yosef without Yaakov would be nothing, but Yaakov without Yosef would be nothing, because Yaakov is just the core of the fire, but the flame that burns, that flame that was their Geula in Mitzrayim, was really from Yosef. And he says something so fantastic. He says that's why Yosef was put in Egypt, which was the hotbed of Arayot, the greatest tum'ah. The Maharal has his first essay in the Sefer of Be'er HaGolah is about this, of why Hashem chose, in the Sefer that he has on Pesach, what's it called? I'm mixing up now, right? He has in Gevurat Hashem. In Gevurat Hashem, he has the first essay is on this. Why Hashem chose the worst place of Tum'ah, the sin city of the world, for creating Am Yisrael. And he says, Rabbi Maral in his ambiguous language always, he says, because Teva Hadavar Liyod Nirsham Mehevcho, everything gets affected by its opposite. But according to this, is the Perush of Maral is exactly this. You put Yosef in the worst nisayon, and he comes burning with a fire, punching back. That created the zchut of the entire Klal Yisrael. The entire Klal Yisrael being saved. In the hotbed of Arayot, in the sin city of the world, not one woman, aside from Shlomit Bat Divrit, which was raped, not one woman did Arayot in all the hundreds of years that they were there. Can you imagine that? Zchut of Yosef. Right? That's why it says Zera Shimshon, that's why it says, Bnei Yaakov veYosef Selah. Yaakov did something that deserved the galut, but Yosef fixed it. It was the fire of Yosef that stemmed from Yaakov. So it is Yaakov, but it's Yaakov on steroids. That's why we need Yosef to have Geula. Mashiach ben Yosef is the first step to Geula, because that pride of being able to not change your name, not change your language, not change your pride, that is the core element that Hashem is showing Moshe Rabbeinu in the very beginning in the Seneh. Says that fire that Yosef had, that's the zchut. That's einenu ukal. Ke'Hashem shera'ita seneh oseh shlichuti. Just like you saw, the seneh is in fire and it's not burning. Yosef was in fire. He was in the worst situation possible, but he was not consumed by it. He withstood the nisayon, and therefore it says, Kach telech b'shlichuti ve'encha nizok. Yosef was in the highest level of tum'ah. He kept himself miliyot nizok. It's so appropriate for beginning of Shovavim. He did not change his name, his language. His identity was intact. He was proud of it. And because of that, Nigla Kadosh Baruch Hu b'seneh, Hashem appears to Moshe Rabbeinu in his seneh, she'afki haya sham ha'esh, that even though that the fire was there, einenu ukal, it was not consumed, and that's the message of the beginning of the Geula. You want to know how you get out of Galut? You got to be proud. You got to keep those things under pressure. In a regular beautiful day, it's not a big feat to keep everything, but when you become under pressure, and you still keep everything intact, that's when a person is really measured based on the pressure that he could withstand, and that's why they came out in the zchut of Yosef HaTzadik, like the Gemara says, we say this in Hallel, right? Hayam Ra'ah Vayanos, that even the Kriyat Yam Suf was done, which is the second half of the Geula. Pesach has two halves. Even that was in the zchut of Yosef, because hundreds of years earlier he withstood an nisayon and he ran out of the house of Potiphera and Eshet Potiphera. Now the sea sees that, and he's going to be running away from Klal Yisrael, opening up. And that's a tremendous thing, that when you do something, when you make a decision, you're creating a reality, not just for now, you're creating reality for hundreds, if not thousands of years later, and that zchut should be standing for us, B'ezrat Hashem. Amen. Hazaku Baruch.